Good afternoon, everyone. This is Lisa Harnish with Certification Partners. I'm here with today's latest CIW webinar. We're going to be talking about creating a standards-compliant website, the tips, the tricks, and the traps. And we're here with Dr. James Stanger and Stephen Schneider and special guest Eric Meyer. James, you want to say hello?
You bet. Hey, how you doing, everybody? It's good to be here. Very good to be here. Stephen, how you doing, man?
I am doing all right on this chilly afternoon.
It is a chill. It's a chilly morning for me anyway, but I know what you're saying. How you doing, Eric? It's an afternoon for you, is it not, there in Cleveland?
It is, yes, and it's a beautiful winter day.
All right, man. Well, we like beautiful winter days. Well, let's go ahead, everybody, and get started talking about this webinar, talking about how to create a standards-compliant website. What kind of tips can people look for? What are some of the tricks? What are some of the traps? The agenda that we're going to be taking a look at today is first a bit of a commercial interlude talking about what CIW is for those who don't know. We'll be brief. Then we'll be talking about standards and sites. What are some of the things that you can do to get that going? And then we'll be talking about how you can get there with CIW. So this should be a fun, interesting kind of interactive discussion between Eric, Stephen, and myself. So looking forward to it. Well, what is CIW? For those of you who don't know, it's a skills-based education program. It's a certification. We take a holistic approach to both education and the technologies that are taught within it. We provide courses and certification exams that prove to people that they know what they're doing. People take these exams to show that they have, in fact, picked up all the necessary competencies and essential skills for web development and design. It's a vendor-neutral approach, CIW is. We take the best vendor applications out there as judged by industry, open source, those provided by Adobe or whatever, and we take a competency-based, outcome-based approach to education. We have a globally accepted program. We've almost 1 million courses and exams delivered worldwide. Over 60,000 certified individuals have taken CIW. CIW is created by web experts. A community of thousands of web professionals over the years and months have answered surveys and provided key input to what CIW is. It's also designed by experts in education. We consult regularly with people from universities, community colleges, and high schools to make sure CIW teaches the right material. As a result, universities, secondary schools, and community colleges worldwide and learning centers worldwide use CIW, from Kaplan Home Learning College in the United Kingdom, Western Governors University, New Hebei University in China, as well as secondary and post-secondary institutions around the globe. We use the CIW Advisory Council's individuals in it to make sure that CIW contains the right technical content and the right instructional design to put together a nice package of training. The CIW Advisory Council is a cross-section of industry, academia, and government, and not-for-profit organizations. And we have people that we regularly consult with, for example, Eric, but also people from Google, people from various certification companies, but also Intel, HP, and others to make CIW what it should be. As a result, CIW has been named as a key way for people to fast-track their design and development careers. And Internet.com has named CIW a top developer and recommends CIW as one of the top 5 certifications that put developers on the fast track. And Internet.com has noted that CIW has the distinction of being an industry standard, education standard for webmasters. That's because we provide the right in-demand skill sets, and also people who get CIW certified get a salary bump on what they do. And you can check out this article on Internet.com, and we'll be getting you a PDF of this particular slide deck, so that you can go and take a look at this URL yourself. Well, we've got Stephen Schneider with us. Stephen, are you still with us?
I am still here.
Yes, that's good. That's good. We had some audio issues earlier, but sounds like things are looking good. Stephen has been is an open source developer extraordinaire. He also is a fantastic educator, working with people, frankly, across the globe implementing CIW. We also have with us Eric Meyer. a noted web developer and author. Eric, you've worked with the W3C as an invited authority and a consultant in various capacities, including the W3C's Cascading Style Sheets standard. Can you talk a little bit more about what your work has been with the W3C as well as your author work?
Well, I was, as you say, an invited expert with the CSS working group for 7 years or so. Being part of working group discussions, and my role, I viewed my role as being the author advocate, the person who would say, hey, authors would really like that, or authors would really hate that. I did come in sort of late to the game, so I wasn't able to maybe address some of the things that authors came to hate, like the definitions of height and width, but, there you go. And I also was, I was the author of most of the first official W3C test suite, the CSS1 test suite, because I had created one for myself and then sent it to the working group to see if they were interested, and that's how I ended up being an invited expert. And then we took that, added some things to it, and made that the first test suite. So since I left the working group back in 2003 or 4, whenever it was, I sort of faded out, so it's hard to pin it down to an exact date. I still correspond with people there, and I still stay involved in public discussions, and so my role, I think, is to try to keep things as clear as possible, which is not always easy with specifications, but to say, hey, this is confusing.
No, it's not.
Could we clarify this? Yeah.
I like that because so as you were in on the ground floor and talking about CSS, you were basically making sure people can articulate ideas, right, clearly, and that's really essential because it's very easy for people to turn things into gobbledygook, right? And your job would be to say, no, it needs to be stated very clearly.
Yeah, that was always the goal, as clearly as possible. I mean, specifications are not really for designers or page authors; they're for browser implementers. But within that, it's a good idea to be clear so that browser implementers, you don't have 2 different interpretations from 2 different browsers, because God knows we've had enough of that in the last 15 years, right? And also too, so hopefully it will be clear enough that someone who at least has some familiarity with computers could go in and look at the spec and get an idea of what's going on. They might not necessarily understand every last sort of subtle implication of the way things go together, but if the way that color is described is in completely dense thesis-ese, that doesn't help anyone, as opposed to the way it is now. I mean, the description of color is pretty straightforward. Like, it colors the foreground of the element, which is the text, and the borders. There you go. Right. So.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more about some of the authoring that you've done since, as you got involved with the W3C.
You actually, the publication date you have for the definitive guide is from the 3rd edition. I wrote the 1st edition in 2000 while I was still a member of the working group. And actually, a little piece of trivia, there's a whole section in the 1st edition of CSS, the definitive guide, that is the only existing documentation of a property that never went anywhere. So I can claim that on my tombstone. But I've also written, other books, not just that one, but also, more sort of practical, hands-on project books like the ones I did for new writers, and then the most recent one, Smashing CSS. My role, I'm not really a designer. I have primitive design sense at best. And I'm a developer, at least to some degree, not enough that I could necessarily get a job as a programmer, but enough that I can sort of hack my way around. I view my role as explaining the technical stuff to the people who are not so technical. So, here's how to use CSS if you've never touched CSS before, or you have some familiarity with CSS, here's how to use it in more advanced ways, and try to, explain it in a way that people then can sort of solidify in their heads how that works, so that they then don't have to look at the book again, they can go and do their own thing. So that's what I try to do, and that's sort of what we try to do with an event apart, is to have speakers who talk about sort of advanced and developing topics to an audience of experienced attendees who, have been in the business and know what they're doing, but, want to sort of think about and hear about that in the next step, like what's coming and how can they refine, how can they advance what they do more.
Tell us more about an event apart. This is a conference that is designed for developers and designers to get together. You have a lot of experts, in addition to yourself, many other experts who attend these. You do about 6 or so a year, or is it more than that nowadays?
We did 5 in this past year, and we're doing 6 in 2011. And I don't have any comment on years beyond that. But yeah, it's we try to get people who are also expert in the field. I mean, what we aim for is a conference where the speakers and the attendees are really almost colleagues, right? They're at sort of the same level. They can have a conversation, and it's not, the attendees don't feel completely left behind by the speakers or even vice versa. And we've had speakers tell us, is like they've said that the people who attend the show are just amazingly sharp. And, a lot of them have been in the field 5 or more years. Some of them have been in the field more than 10 years. They know what they're doing. They're already craftspeople. They not only know what they're doing, but care about doing it right. And that's, that's the kind of people that's the kind of people we are. That's the speakers. That's the kind of people they are, and that we get in. So it really makes for some interesting conversations.
Very good. Who are some of the?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh. Sorry, who are some of the speakers that you've gotten to show up in the past?
Well, there's me, Jeffrey Zeldman. We co-founded the conference, so we pretty much speak at every show. Jeff Veen, who's a long veteran. Jared Spool, Jason Santa Maria. They're just so I could go on forever. Aaron Walter from MailChimp, Luke Verblushki, who knows probably more about mobile than anybody else I've ever met. And Peter Paul Koch from the Netherlands, who's doing a lot of mobile as well. In the coming year, Sarah Parmenter will be speaking. Nicole Sullivan's going to do some presentations. Christina Halverson's been bringing content strategy to the audience and getting into that in detail. I feel bad because I will have left out a lot of other amazing speakers and really sharp people, but we've been doing it now since 2006 basically, so it's a pretty deep.
So you've been
alumni.
Yeah, so you've been doing the last 4 years, and you've got quite a lot of accomplishments in getting people together, talking about development, but also about design, mobile devices, things of that nature. So if you go up to the Event Apart website, the URL is there. You can learn more about the conferences that Eric and his group put together. Well, let's talk a bit then about what it means to create a standards-compliant website. Eric, we've put together a couple of ideas, and if there's something, glaring omissions, just say, hey, I want to interject this here. But let's talk a bit about some of the things that you can do on a basic level to create standards-compliant websites. And for the first thing, let's define what we mean by standards-compliant. Now, Eric, in the previous webcast, you used the phrase, and it's an interesting one, anything web native, and that's when we were talking about HTML5 and Flash and Silverlight, and you were espousing the idea of, well, web native technology such as JavaScript or things like what HTML5 is turning into or things like that. That's interesting, but when it comes to what a standard is, obviously we're talking about W3C compliant type technology, CSS, HTML, right? Things of that nature. What else could you have to say, or Stephen, about defining what a standards-compliant website means? And what perspective do you have on that? We'll start with Eric first.
Okay. I mean, there are two kinds of standards, obviously. There's the one that the web standards crowd usually, of which I count myself, is usually talking about when they say standards, which is W3C, sort of open standards, things that are not royalty encumbered or patent encumbered or otherwise legally encumbered. They've gone through a sort of a collaborative process. So, like you say, the HTML, CSS, the DOM scripting, SVG, web fonts now would qualify for that, I argue, and a whole raft of other technologies, although those are kind of the ones that I think the web crowd in general focuses on. Not too many web designers really care about Sparkle, but there are people who care passionately about Sparkle. Anyway, but then there are the other standards, which are the what sometimes are called marketplace standards, which are things like Flash, right, which are everywhere. Silverlight could also
I call those I call those de facto standards. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It's a marketplace standard, just because
Yeah.
they get a lot of widespread use. Some image form, most of the image formats we use were never actually made like there's no W3C specification for GIFs. And yes, I say
Right.
ORG, or JPEGs. There was one for PNG, but we use them we use them everywhere, and so those are, yes, they were written down somewhere. There's at least a specification for them somewhere, but they're sort of looped in because everyone uses them. So, yeah, that's what I tend to mean by standards is sort of W3C type web standards, but there is the other meaning of that as well.
But yeah, marketplace standards, interesting perspective. Stephen, anything else on that?
Well, actually, I think Eric did a really good job summing it up. I was just going to refer to commercial standards, but the commercial standards are what Eric was referring to as market standards. There's for the commercial products. Flash has their own standard base as well as Microsoft for how things are supposed to work. But when we're talking about really true, getting out there and getting a site that's going to be accessible to everybody, then you almost have to fall back to W3C standards for how a page is going to be structured and how it's going to work and how you're going to interact with a particular site so that they can be viewed pretty much everywhere or on a different type of platform.
You bet. I think you tend to see that as well, the marketplace standards, as Eric put it, and the W3C compliant standards, because you see various companies like Adobe, they work a lot with the W3C committees, right? I mean, they contribute very actively, and it's a constant dialogue between them. So that makes sense.
Dialogue is one word to use.
Well, tell us more about that, Eric. That's interesting.
It has been said, and I don't think all that inaccurately, that working groups are battlegrounds. They are arenas where competitors fight it out for market dominance. They just do it in a different venue than in the market.
Cool. Yeah.
They don't necessarily, yes, they end up working together, but the consensus is generally arrived at, it's not always, it's not often. Everyone's sitting down and saying, how can we make the web better today? It's more, hey, we want to do this in our browser. Everyone else should do it too, so we can make it part of the spec. And other people are either saying, okay, we want to do that too, or saying, we're not really interested in making elements rotate or in 3 dimensions or whatever it is, right? Apple wanted to do 2D and 3D transformation of elements, so they did it, wrote it down as a spec, and now that's sitting in the working group, and we're seeing how far other browser makers will take it. Firefox does 2D transforms. I don't remember if they do 3D transforms at the moment, but right, and they may never, or they might do it eventually, or Microsoft might never implement either of those transforms specifications, and so then you end up with a spec that never really goes anywhere. But it's not that the working group said, hey, everyone wants to do transforms. Let's write a specification together and join hands and sing Kumbaya beneath rainbow skies. It was a vendor said, we want to do this. This is how we're doing this. We'll write it down and submit it as a spec for other people to comment on. Right? And that's how a lot of this stuff happens. XML HTTP requests, otherwise, the underpinnings of AJAX. Microsoft just did that in the late 90s. No one asked them to. There was no working group that said, hey, it would be really cool if this existed. Maybe individual people said it. But Microsoft just did it. And then they documented what they did, and everyone else did it. And eventually, it got written down. So, it turns out that because everyone else did it too, that really caught on and eventually became part of a spec. Whereas, 2D transforms might eventually become an actual W3C specification, and maybe 3D transforms doesn't because it doesn't get enough marketplace adoption. It doesn't have enough interoperable implementations, or maybe it does. Maybe every browser maker does it because, every web designer in the world wants to make it so that when you click on the Contact Us, the whole page flips over and you get the Contact Us form. Like, okay, so then maybe it becomes a spec. So, but it's still, it's not the collaborative sort of, Grecian philosophers reclining in a forum, sipping wine and debating sort of the Platonic ideal of what the web should be. It's absolutely not like that at all, sadly.
Yeah, I remember Socrates.
I wanted to have like a little laurel wreath on my head, you know what I mean?
Remember, Socrates was forced to drink what was it?
Hemlock.
Poison, hemlock. So it wasn't exactly friendly then.
And exactly.
Yeah.
So how many, Eric? Let me ask you this: how many companies will come to a working group with various ideas that basically just never see the light of day? Is there a lot, or on a daily basis, or every now and then, or?
Companies. There are a lot of individuals that make proposals that never go anywhere on the public mailing lists. Companies typically, if one browser maker goes to the effort of investing in implementing something, the others are at least going to take notice. I'm trying to think of things that have just sort of died, where like one person did it and then nobody else was interested. Nothing's immediately coming to mind. I'm sure there's an example that I'm overlooking. I think there were some trial implementations of some of the early like advanced layout stuff, but those have never really caught on. But sometimes it can take a decade. Web fonts were originally implemented in the mid to late 90s. They were just implemented in completely incompatible ways by Netscape and Microsoft, and so like they kind of never went anywhere. Now, 12, 13 years later, we're seeing things come together because it's a need that's never gone away, and now it's happening, at least however slowly. So.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, because that was actually going to be my next question. Is just for people that may be in the audience that are wondering, well, how long does it take something to actually become a standard? It's a long, involved process, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. There's really just no way around it. I wish it were otherwise. Sometimes, there are some things that like advanced layout. Why do we not have advanced layout yet? CSS gives us layout, but most people know that it has its limitations and quirks. It would be really nice if we just sort of had like a grid description language or whatever. I don't even care what it is, and we just could really use a very strong advanced layout system. And CSS doesn't have it yet, and we've only needed it for 15 years now, right? So web fonts waited almost that long, and but sometimes things happen very quickly. Right, transforms, the 2D transform spec is no more than a year and a half old. I don't remember its exact release date, but it was in mid to late 2009. And there are multiple browsers that support 2D transforms already. IE9, once it comes out as a final, may be one of those. Regardless of what its previews do, they're always capable of yanking something if they don't think they have a good enough support by the time they have to ship final. But let's assume for the moment that IE9 does support 2D transforms. Like that would be like 18 months to go from someone documenting a draft specification to having pretty much every major browser support that in one way or another. So sometimes things do move quickly, but it's kind of more typically the case that they don't.
Gotcha. Just out of curiosity, then we need to get back to James's slides. Is HTML5? What's really been the timeline on that?
Quick adoption of simple stuff, like adding new elements. Pretty much every browser will recognize the new elements, and not mangle your page as a result. Maybe some of the extra fiddly bits, and the non-markup portions of it, like local storage and stuff like that, will probably take longer. It's not that big a deal, as I understand it, to add to your browser engine, hey, now there's an article element. Please don't mangle it. Right? That's not such a huge deal. But implementing something like locally storing data that's got a whole host that touches security and the local file store and persistence of data and when do you persist and when do you don't, it's a really complicated thing to do. I mean, it's easy enough to just say, store data, right? But to do it properly is not easy. And so that stuff might, probably will take longer. Other bits that are associated with HTML like web workers and some of the other things, audio and video, codec support, it gets complicated. It's not like it used to be. The web used to be, 19 tags in a song, pretty much. Way back in the day, it was really easy to write a web browser. Like people wrote web browsers. There were a whole bunch of early web browsers that no one remembers. If anyone on this call remembers Cello, I'll be really impressed.
Oh, I do.
Okay, so there you go. I'm really impressed.
Yeah.
Written by a guy who worked for a law library, the Cornell Law Library. Great guy.
That's right. Yeah, it was all about the legal browser. Yeah.
Right. His name's Tom Bruce. He's a really great guy. He has fantastic stories he has to tell. But okay, right. So like in the early days, making a web browser was no big deal. Now it's really complicated. So. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Good.
I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Yeah, great. No, we invited you on here to stay as silent as possible, Eric. So no, that's good. You're good.
I'll hit you right now.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. Well, now when it comes to standards, the whole idea of standards was, well, look, we have to define standards for people to create web browsers too. But a lot of the folks who are certainly on this call associated with CIW are very interested in making sure that their pages follow these standards so they look good in a browser. Now, one thing that you and I have discussed, and Steve and I often will discuss, that standards aren't there just for vendors. They're not just there for theoretical things or for an additional concern. They're the very things that make page development possible because they create compatible pages. They allow a certain stable platform so that you can create sophisticated applications on them. And also so you can define pages that are accessible, not only to people with disabilities, but also to machines, so that information can be formatted as people expect. My question, Eric, has to do with, as a developer, how much have standards made it possible for you in a practical way to create applications for your clients that they like, right? Or how much have standards been, gotten in the way of it, of defining pages or applications that your clients like?
I've never had standards get in my way.
Okay. How come? Why is that?
That may speak to the kinds of clients that I have, right?
Right.
So, I can't exactly say that I am representative.
Yeah. How have they helped you?
Well, it's because I have something that's I have sort of a common basis, right? Things that are standards based typically are supported by multiple browsers. All the browsers support HTML, so I don't have to worry about writing a page, writing a website in one language for one browser and another language for another web browser, which was a real possibility in the mid-90s, right? We were staring down the barrel of that particular gun. And so, yes, with CSS, you can have some inconsistencies, although they're a lot less than they used to be. The problems with CSS now, I think more people are starting to complain a little bit more about CSS, and I'm actually one of them, because we don't have to fight browsers anymore. Now we're fighting the limitations of the language. It used to be that we were so focused on dealing with, oh my God, this browser does float this way and this browser has this float bug, that it wasn't, most people didn't sort of look beyond it to say, God, wouldn't it be cool if I didn't have to mess with float at all, right? But it is there, right? And so there's that consistency. And so, yes, even though I might sort of grumble that CSS makes me jump backwards through a couple of hoops in order to make this or that layout happen, I can be reasonably sure that it's going to be, fairly consistent between browsers, if not completely consistent. I mean, I've had situations in the past year where I've written something and I've just loaded it up in every major recent browser, and it's been the same. It's been fine, right? maybe not exactly to every single pixel the same, but it was the layout that I was looking for. It doesn't look awful, and it's completely accessible. And it's been kind of like, oh yeah, this is what we were complaining about 10 years ago, and now here it is, at least sometimes. You know, I haven't had clients where they've said, you know, must be Flash or else, because people wouldn't come to someone like me to say that kind of thing, right? And if they did, I would say, then you have the wrong person, because I don't really know Flash very well. You need someone else. And for accessibility, you know, if you doing like semantic markup is 80% of the accessibility battle. It's not all of it, and it's not necessarily even the most important 20%, but it's still 80% of the battle, and it also helps with search engine optimization for those who follow that particular path. And for that matter, stability, possibly the most stable format in the history of computing. There's an argument to be made that it's HTML, because it's everywhere, and it's easily consumable, and it's based on it's pretty much text, right? It's special text. And so as long as you can read the file in 30 years, it won't be that, like, assuming you can read the media on which the file resides. Once you have the file, HTML is easily transformable into other things, right? So
stability or compatibility has to do not only with being forward compatible and backward compatible, but the ability to format that information so it can be translated into other things easily.
Yeah, I mean, if you need to, right. And something I've been doing recently is I'm actually I'm doing this little side project where I'm basically creating a leaderboard of CSS module editors to sort of show like who's on the most modules and which editors have been on. Like basically, it's got this scoring system where you, depending on what the status of the module is, each editor earns more points, and then it sort of shows you who've been the most effective editors and that sort of thing. It's just a little goof that I'm doing, but my data source, what I'm doing is I have an HTML page that lists all of the information in a table that anyone can view just as a web page, right? But then I process that information as the basis for the programming that like does all the calculations and the scoring and the sorting and the ranking and stuff like that. I don't have a database. I don't store it in some alternate format like a tab delimited text file or whatever. That's where I started, but that's not where I'll end. Eventually I'm going to throw away the tab delimited text file, and the perfectly viewable and machine parsable HTML page will serve as the basis for all of the programming that's on top of it. So, you know, that to me is an advantage. I don't have to like have the same information in 3 different ways, or I don't have to like pour all of this information into a database and then spit out HTML in order to show just the raw data. The HTML is the raw data. And it's very structured, so it's easy for me to say, you know, this is the name of the spec, this is its URL, these are the editors who worked on it, these are the people who contributed to it, this is its status, this is the last time it was updated. It's all there, and it's all structured. So, you know, there you go.
So this way, standards make it possible for you to create all sorts of development for a client, but also future development, and all that information is readily accessible as you store it. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Now, when it comes to specific tips for creating a standards-compliant website, I threw some things up here that are Eric and Stephen very basic tips, and so feel free to jump in with more advanced ones. But the ways to start, of course, are code correctly, right? Specify your doc type, use a proper template for your HTML. Validate constantly, and there are standalone validators that are available in Adobe products or whatever. I usually go up to validator.w3.org, right? Even though the error message is up there, I don't know if you've ever noticed, and Stephen and certainly Eric, both of you, we've talked about this. One simple error, right, and you get a god-awful list, right, of things. So it's not particularly intuitive. Do you have any tips for anybody about that, other than, well, just don't code wrong, how do you, get through some of those lists? Yeah.
You proofread, and we've got a lab in our course where we start students out coding, and one of the biggest things that I can tell my teachers that are going through this course is that when you get to this lab, and you're going to have your students who are coding websites and whatnot, and they're going to go out and they're going to validate for the first time. I said, one, be sure to spend plenty of time on this lab, And two, don't pull your hair out, because once your students validate, they go out there and validate their code, and they come up with 900 million billion errors. The students are just going to raise their hand. I can't find this. For the teachers, save yourself time. Is proofread. Just simply proofread your code, before you go out there. Because you're right, James. All it takes is one little typo, one little missed closing bracket, or quotation mark or something where it needs to be, and the validator will puke all over you, and it'll puke all over the rest of your code. And so, go in and proofread your code. If you do come up with, and then go out and validate, and you come up with a bunch of errors, know that you're going to knock a lot of them out just by going in and fixing a couple of probably typos that you have in the first few lines of content that's in there, and it all starts to smooth out. But the biggest thing about using this is because it does help your site, and because this is working towards developing your site or designing your site using standards. And the W3C even says, that if you want your site, if it is a big deal for you to have your site to meet accessibility standards, like any government or state site must have in order to receive federal funding, then some of the simplest things that you can do for accessibility is by following the standards and using the correct code and using the correct standard to do it, such as using XHTML 1.0 transitional. If you just follow that throughout and keep it consistent throughout your entire site, you're leaping by strides along the line of making sure that your site will validate, making sure that it's going to be accessible, and even assist with search engine optimization. So there's a lot about just keeping the stuff simple and keeping the tips simple, because there's a lot of people that will just throw content out there and don't take the time to validate or proofread their code, and it would just carry your site, make so much improvement in your site.
Yeah, careful consideration of your code is important, and also something you touched on, Stephen, is that pick a standard and stick to it. Eric, I remember a couple of years ago you were saying whatever standard you pick, XHTML 1.0 transitional or 4.01, whatever standard you want to use, grab one and stick to it. I think I've got that on the next slide. I think that's a really important thing. Anything else, Stephen, or anything else, Eric?
No.
Now, other things that we talk about, an important point, Eric, that you foregrounded, I think, on the last webcast, is that just because your page validates according to any validator, the W3 one or any of the good standalone validators that are out there, doesn't necessarily mean that the page is going to look good in various browsers. You still have to validate in a different sense that your page looks as expected according to various browsers, and we'll talk about a couple of ways to do that here shortly. Let's talk about mobile platforms. It seems to me that standards-based development is increasingly important when it comes to working with the mobile browsers that you find on the Droid or the iPhone or whatever browser you want to that's used. Not only that, but applications that are used on mobile phones. It seems that this standards-based development is going to apply equally well there, because isn't that a common denominator that can help you make sure that your applications work from one mobile platform to the next? Eric, Stephen, what do you think?
Well, they don't on my BlackBerry.
Certainly not on my BlackBerry. That browser is just so awful. I've mentioned that before, but can't standards help us do that though?
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
Can't standards help us develop applications that will work well from one mobile platform to the next, from your iPhone to your BlackBerry and all that?
Oh, sure, they can. Like any development environment, you can always do stupid things with it, but you can also do really awesome things with it. Especially some of the stuff that I was mentioning before with HTML5, things like local storage of data, and some of the other things that are built that are in theory built into it. As mobile devices implement those, you can go more offline, right? So you don't have to have a signal or a connection to the internet in order to look at your last 50 email messages. If you have a sort of a web app, a web native mail client, sort of like a Gmail for your iPhone, that's written in HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, etc. It can store the last 15 messages locally. Okay.
Okay.
And then just sort of keep doing it, or the last 100 or the last whatever, with that local store. So then it becomes a lot more like an application. We're sort of used to this idea that mobile devices have these specific applications specifically written for the devices, and they can like live locally on your phone, and they have their data, so you can like play a game even if you're on an airplane and your phone's in airplane mode.
Right.
And we're using of web pages and web applications as sure, as long as you have a connection, it's awesome. Well, the stuff in HTML5 blurred, kind of erases that line. It makes it possible to erase that line where you can do stuff offline, and then once you get back online, it can send your high scores or send the mail that you composed while you were on the plane, whatever it is. And there are, I think it'll be important in that way. And what makes that even more important is that if you have lots of different mobile devices, they all have web browsers, right? Maybe your BlackBerry web browser is awful, but the Droids all have what they have, and the Google
Good
phones
one.
and and the iPhone, and they all have web browsers. And so
Safari.
if you can write what you're doing using web native technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc., then you have an application that's cross mobile device, at least potentially cross mobile device, and you didn't have to like rewrite it in one in Objective-C and the other one in whatever version of C is acceptable, or Java or whatever, right? You don't have to write it in 6 languages or 3 languages. You write it in one set of languages, and you're done. And then, if it is kind of an online, like if it has an online-offline hybrid, upgrading it's really easy. You can upgrade it for people. So all those things, like those are all advantages. There are some downsides. There are people who make the argument that native apps are more responsive, they're faster, that they're usually better polished and designed. I don't agree that is a function of being native versus being web. It's a function of who's working in each of those sort of venues, right? It's sort of like people used to say CSS websites all look the same when they're boring. Well, it's because at the time, most of the people who were doing CSS websites were people like me who thought that if you had a box and you gave it a background color, that's design, baby, right? It took Dave Shea with the CSS Zen Garden to show that CSS design can look like anything. It can be amazing. It can still be, it can still be boxy and boring, or it can be incredible. And that's when a lot of designers first looked at it and said, oh, wait, you can do this? Okay. CSS websites don't all have to look the same. And, it wasn't the technology, right? Dave didn't suddenly use this special extra version of CSS in order to make the Zen Garden look cool. He just used CSS in a way that, made it look good, whereas people who, like me, who are not designers, couldn't do that, so.
Very good. Eric, you were bringing up the idea, you brought the idea of, in a sense, kind of the lowest common denominator, grab the technology that works the best. We have a question from a guy named Andrew Stoller who is asking about for a video-intensive site, whether it be for a mobile platform or for a, desktop-based browser, what kind of video format would be a good one? And I'll throw an idea out there that the lowest common denominator video format might be the one to work. So instead of using maybe a Flash wrapper-based one, FLV, you might want to go with something that is more open. That way, any site, any browser is able to open it rather than any one plug-in enabled browser. I think you'd agree with that, just because it's anything that's more web native is the way to go, right?
If you can get away with it, sure. But there's a reason YouTube hasn't done that yet, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It depends on who's coming to your site. YouTube has to cater to the world, right?
The audience, the world, right?
Right, that's their audience. And so while they've experimented with HTML5, they have a lot of Flash-based video because that works for them. But there are other, I'm trying to remember that. Was it Slide? Not SlideShare. Who's it? Because there was a Scriber. I think that's it.
Ooh, can't remember. Go ahead.
Yeah, but they were doing all their stuff in like all their slideshows in Flash, and they completely moved to HTML5, and that worked for them. They feel it worked for them anyway. So yes, you want to
According to their audience.
Right. You want to go for your most common denominator for your audience, not for what browserstat.com says is the common denominator, because they are not monitoring your site. You are. If you're doing a new site, maybe you start there with BrowserStat, but then, or those sorts of things. But then after a few months, if you look, you might look at it and say, geez, everyone's got the absolute, everyone who comes here has the latest version of whatever browser they're using. I could stop doing the Flash thing. Or, hey, I have a lot of people who come here with Internet Explorer 7. I better stick with the Flash.
So you're going to stick with the Flash thing.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Very good. So it's the importance of listening to an audience is very important, and making sure that you know what your audience is. Rather than going up to Netcraft or whatever and getting that, you need to use the stats that are specific to your own site. Yeah, very good. Well, let's talk about a couple of kind of tricks types of things here. Let's talk for a second about standards and SEO and how they can help you. Search engine optimization is all about, making your site look natural, right? Organically it fits into what people are looking for, and then your site appears high on the search engine results list. How do web standards help you do that? Help you conform to SEO or perform better in SEO? I've got a couple of ideas, but I'd like to hear a bit more, Eric, about what you've got to say about that.
Well, there's semantic markup. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Google actually pays attention to that. So
tell everybody just a bit more about semantic markup and what that means in terms of formatting data, things like that.
Well, it's things like using headings for headings. H1 for your page heading and H2 for your section headings, as opposed to span style equals heading 2.
Right.
If you're doing that, stop it.
Yeah.
There was I just saw it recently, and I'm not sure where it went. Google actually has, I think they made a change that strengthens that sort of stuff. I can't remember now, unfortunately. Wait, maybe I found it. Something about, no, I'm not going to find it now. I was hoping that I could dig it out of my RSS feeds quickly, but it was, effectively, be more semantic. Use paragraphs for paragraphs. That does help. It's not going to take you from the 10th page to the first page. The only thing that can do that is links, right? Links from other people to your stuff, and that's content is more important than anything else you can. Like good content is more important than really anything else you can do. But with the standards, it can give you a little boost, and also it makes it.
But the standards make sure that your content gets formatted in such a way that the search engine bots, spiders, or whatever can go grab that stuff much easier. Right. I think that's your point. Is that
they're more likely to be able to tell, hey, this is a heading as opposed to this is body text or whatever, because this is an H type tag as opposed to a P tag. And also, for that matter, it makes it more likely that more people will be able to access your information in some fashion, right? If everything you do is divs and spans with CSS applied to it, then someone who comes with like an old BlackBerry browser that's a text-only browser, they're just going to get this like this undifferentiated sea of text. Whereas if it's got headings, they can, the BlackBerry browser can say, oh, it's an H2, I should boldface this, and maybe set it a little bit apart from the rest of the text, right? So that's one of the things about the web. The web is backwards compatible in its very design, right? It's designed to degrade into less capable user agents, less capable browsers, such that you can still see the information even if it doesn't have all of the pretty colors and the fonts and the fades and the whatever, right? You can still
the layout, right.
Yeah. And then if you have CSS capable browsers and you use CSS, then you can get a consistent look and feel. But that's the thing, that one of the things that by its very nature the web is designed to do is to be like analog TV. It might be a little fuzzy, the image might be sort of wavering back and forth a little bit, but you can still see and hear it. as opposed to things like Flash, which are more like digital TV, which is either you've got it or you don't.
Right? Or you don't. Yeah.
Right. If the signal degrades too far, you get nothing on your digital TV. You just get the signal lost. And that's the same as with Flash. Either you've got the Flash plugin and you can see it, or you don't and you can't. And there are arguments to support either approach, but this is one of those areas where it's really an advantage. And having marked up text makes it much easier for Google to see it. I mean, yes, it's possible for Flash applets or whatever they're called, whatever the kids are calling them these days, to be indexed by Google. But if you don't take care in structuring what's in your Flash thing, then Google has to just it's sort of the equivalent of having divs and spans for everything, right? So, I mean, content has to be structured no matter where you put it in order for it to be a good SEO thing.
Very good. Very good. Now, Eric, one of the things that we talked about earlier was picking a standard and sticking to it, XHTML or HTML. I wanted to point out that one of the things you can do is whatever standard you want to use templates and, code bits and things like that to make sure that you are coding to standard. And also, we already talked, Eric, about the importance of listening to your audience. It's kind of what I meant, anyway, by customer communication being vital. Talk to your specific customer or find out what your audience wants and does. Anything more to add to those couple of points?
No, I don't think so.
Stephen, anything?
No, I'm really good there because those points are super huge as far as being able to. I mean, especially the part as far as talking to your audience and the customer. Find out what's actually needed on the site and the best way to get it done. I think that's perfect.
Thanks, Stephen. The next thing we talked about were some traps, the typical shortcuts that people will tend to do. Stephen, you mentioned that sometimes the online site creation tools and templates don't work as well. They don't create the standard code that you'd expect. And I care to
right.
talk about that.
I knew this slide was coming up, so I bit my tongue as you were talking to Eric about using templates and things like that are good, and to a point they are. But there are so many tools that are on the web today that will allow you to create a website in just a matter of minutes and in a matter of seconds. And anybody can develop their own tool that allows for ease of website creation. But and if you're going to follow these models and if you're going to use these tools, then you just need to make sure that they are using and putting the code in, following the standards. And if so, then great. It's probably a useful tool. But beware, because not all of those tools that are out there that are going to allow you to do things on a rapid basis are going to follow, actual standards or adhere to them, throughout all of their different operations. And so that is a trap to definitely look out for. Is if it's too simple to be true, too easy to be true, then chances are it probably is.
Probably is. And one of the ways that you can, by the way, make sure that you are getting your code looked at the right way, you can go to browsershots.org, kind of an interesting little URL where you can have it take a look for you at multiple browsers. There are many different browsers, about over a dozen, and platforms. So, a particular browser like Firefox on Windows or Chrome on Linux or on a Mac platform, and you can see exactly how those things will look. It's a pretty interesting way to go. Eric, you and I
validate your code.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, of course, validate your code. That's the most important. I would say a very, very important thing. But also we talked about, Stephen, we talked about the idea of paying attention to your what your particular audience has. If they're all, like Eric was saying, IE7, then you can go with Flash or vice versa. So, but what about what if a client wants some sort of feature that is not considered standard or whatever? You can't really talk them out of it, can you? I mean, or can you? I mean, would you say, well, your audience, you may like that client, but your audience doesn't? I suppose is probably the best approach for that, right? If you can come up with actual statistics that say, as good an idea as that seems, your particular audience doesn't seem to, conform to it, or doesn't really.
It's getting a poll for what the audience wants. What is the target market for the site? What is the target audience for the site? Collect the demographics off of that audience. Do they like Flash? Do they like technology? Or are they very technology intuitive? Or the example that I always give is a website that I am working on for my mother-in-law's age group is going to be completely different from the technology that it employs and the way that it is laid out than it will for some digital natives, for a younger audience, today's teenager or whatever that has grown up with using technology or web-based technology. And we have to take that into consideration throughout the whole design process.
Yeah, or a corporate intranet, right? There's a third,
Sure.
idea of how different that would be from the first two you just said. So, yeah.
Sure.
Eric, anything particular to add to this here?
Nope, pretty much not. Stephen captured it quite nicely.
Kind of nailed it. Yeah. Well, ways that we can get there with CIW is, in terms of building a standards-based site, right, is do you have the right kind of background knowledge? And CIW Foundations will get that for you, whether it be an internet business associate to understand all of the pieces of a browser and how project management works, to site development associate, which gives you a very good overview of the entire design process so that you do build a standards-based site. And then network technology associate, which does a fine job explaining the underlying architecture of the internet. These are ways that you can get to the level that Stephen and Eric are talking about. We also have the CIW Design Specialist and CIW E-Commerce Specialist certifications that focus on standards-based ways to create user interfaces as well as how to get money off the web in terms of site usability, creating storefronts, shopping carts, and things of that nature, and understanding what e-commerce is all about. Next, when it comes to the more developing side of things, you have JavaScript, Perl, and understanding how to do databases. All of these certifications are focused on creating standards-based web design sites and standards-based applications. And so there are ways in which, if you want to create cool, cutting-edge sites, CIW shows how to do that. It contains an approach that basically says, look, you can use all sorts of applications, you can use all sorts of vendor-specific things, but also open source and other ways that will help you progress along the path to becoming a professional web designer. Now, we are going to have a webinar next. It's talking about the browser wars and what those sorts of things mean. And the next webcast will be on January 26th. We'll be doing that at 8 a.m. So stay tuned for that. You can learn more about CIW at CIWcertified.com, as well as get a list of the latest webinars. And we're working on a list for the next 6 months, so any suggestions that anybody has, I'd like to hear about it. Now, what kinds of questions does anybody have for Eric or Stephen in regards to creating standards-based web design? Lisa, any other questions other than the one I saw on the board from Andrew?
There's been a couple more questions also from Andrew Stoller. He's asking about, if building a video-intensive site, what video format do you recommend, and what do we think we're headed towards? He's also asking if we have any specific examples or recommendations.
I would say that, it's all about the right wrapper. I think I sent an email to Andrew earlier. I'll have to resend that on over. But I think the main thing, for me anyway, is the wrapper that is going to apply to the most browsers. And by wrapper, I mean the technology. Is it going to be an HTML5 approach? Is it going to be more of an Apple approach? Or is it going to be more of a, I think, an open standard? Anything MPEG oriented, I'm going to go for, something like that. That's my personal opinion.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, again, I think you have to. I just think you have to go back to what is the target audience? What's the purpose of the site, and what technology does the audience or the typical visitor to that site going to be using? Will they be typically hitting the site from a mobile device, or are they going to be hitting it from a iPad or from a standard computer, standard browser? Can it be intensively using Flash, or do you need to be looking at something else? A lot of it has to depend on what the audience of the site is going to be using, for the most part, I think.
Nothing to add.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Eric, you would say something?
Yeah, no, I just said I have nothing to add to that. That's pretty much right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Lisa, any other questions? Anything like that?
Just got a new one from Leslie Hamilton. For an e-learning developer, which path would you recommend, HTML5 or Flash?
Well, I know what I recommend.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Eric, and then Steven.
HTML. That's just because you can't put Flash up on the web without HTML, whereas you can totally put up HTML without Flash, right? Now, that's not to say that I would not necessarily recommend for someone who's learning that they only pick one or the other. I say start with HTML, but that doesn't mean that Flash is forever dead to you. It means that Flash is something that you learn along the way.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I was just going to say I have to concur with that. I have to concur with that 100% because there's different LMSs support different types of technologies as well, but all of them, as Eric mentioned earlier, everything supports HTML today, and so that's definitely a safer route to go with before you develop something and then try to import it into somebody's learning management system only to find out that it doesn't work because it's in the wrong wrapper or needs to be tweaked somehow or another. But if you've got it in HTML format, then pretty much any system can import it.
The other advantage is that you then become much better at assessing what things need Flash and what things don't, because things like audio and video often do. Not always necessarily, but very often. And or you might say that because of what the client wants to do and the audience that they're dealing with here, even though it would be possible to implement thus and so using HTML, we should really use Flash because of these reasons. It makes you better, more rounded, and to know both of those things. So.
Yeah, my answer is default to HTML5. But then, like Eric and Stephen has also pointed out, audience is key. If you're working in a particular e-learning environment where everybody is going to be totally Flash-centric, then how could you go wrong with that? But I would always default to an HTML or native web sort of approach. What else you got, Lisa?
That pretty much takes care of the questions that are currently pending at the moment. I think we're actually a couple of minutes past the hour, and James and Steve and I are already late for our next meeting, so I think we can go ahead and wrap things up.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Yeah, and Eric,
yeah, we do
appreciate your time. Yeah.
Thank you.
We do appreciate everyone joining us. As James has indicated, we will have a PDF of this slide presentation ready to go to you. It might take me a day or two to get that out to you. And the recording will also be posted to our website sometime within the next few days, I hope. So, thank you, everyone, for participating. We appreciate your attention today.